Hi and welcome back. So in the previous video, we introduced our macroeconomics 3 module, basically looking at the first part of our chapter 10. And we showed the different methods in which standard of living can be measured, which is basically using the market exchange rate or the purchasing power parity method. We also made an example to show why is the purchasing power parity method or the PPP method more efficient in measuring or calculating standard of living to compare between two countries. So for my example, we assumed that an annual consumption per person in South Africa is 60,000 rand per year, where two goods are consumed. That is a car, which costs around 1,000, and a food basket, which costs 20,000 a year, 20,000 rand a year. And we said an annual consumption per person in the United States is $20,000 per year. So a person in the United States also consumes the same goods, which is a car and a food basket. So the price of a car is $10,000, and a basket of food or a food basket is also $10,000. We further made assumptions that South Africans use their cars for an average of 15 years before replacement, while Americans use and replace their cars every year. So South Africans and American cars and food baskets are identical. So we said, how can we use the two methods to compare the consumption per person in South Africa and in the United States? So firstly, we looked at the example using the exchange rate, the market exchange rate method. And we said, given an exchange rate of 30 rands per dollar, so what we'd do is we should convert South African consumption into US dollars using the market exchange rate. So because South African consumption per year is 60,000 rand, we simply divide that by 30 exchange rate figure. So that gives us $2,000. So South African consumption, which is according to dollars, is 2,000. So we simply divide that South African consumption of 2,000 by that of the American consumption. So this would tell us that the South African consumption per person is only 10%, since we got 1 over 10. It's only 10% of US consumption per person. So even though we know that South Africa is relatively poorer than the US, however, these findings are more far-fetched. So when looking at the PPP method, we have to consider the fact that a South African only changes their car once in 15 years. So then we need to convert the amount of expenditure on the car per year or in each year of the 15 years. So we have to divide one car by the 15 years in which it is consumed or used. So doing that, we get the 0.07 units of a car a year, which is consumed by a South African. So we multiply that by the amount of money that an average American uses on a car on a yearly basis. And what we get is $700. So the consumption of food is basically simply the number of bundles that South African consume a year times the price of the basket of food in American dollars. So that's 1 times $10,000. So what we get is these two. So this will bring us to 10,700. So this is the consumption of a South African in dollars per year. So we take that consumption of a South African in dollars and divide it with that of an American. So our findings tells us that a South African consumes 53.5% of what an American consumes per year. So it means that the standard of living in South Africa is still lower. However, it is only lower by 47.5%, or rather 46.5%, which is the difference between 100% and the 53.5%. Okay, so to carry on, in this video, we're basically going to look at the growth rate in different countries since 1950 to see, or sort of have a picture of the trends in growth and differences it has across countries and over the time. So the table that we're going to look at below shows the evolution of output per person, that is GDP divided by population, measured at PPP prices. So it shows for France, Japan, UK, and the US since 1950. So what we're going to see in the table is two main conclusions. That one, there has been a large increase in output per person over the time frame. And two, there has been a convergence, which is a closing up in output per person across countries. So let's look at these factors in detail. So looking at this table, in this last column here, we basically can see that output per person has increased by a factor of 3.1 in the United States, by a factor of 4.3 in France, and by a factor of 10.2 in Japan since 1952 to 2009. So if we go back and look at the first column here, you'll realize that the annual growth rate, as shown here, is the highest in Japan. So this is the reason why we see a higher growth rate in Japan by the end of the time frame, because the annual growth rate was higher in Japan. So the average annual growth rate in Japan from the period of 1950 to 2009 was equals to 3.9%. This high growth rate has led to a tenfold increase in real output per person in Japan over the period of time. So this means that, just like in the case of interest rates per year, the higher the annual growth output per person per year is going to yield us a higher real output per person over the period of time that we are measuring. So a conclusion that we can make from this is that it's clear that a better understanding of growth, if it leads to the design of policies that stimulate growth, can have a very large effect on the standard of living of people. So the second and third column of our table shows us that the level of output per person have converged or become close over time. So if you look at it, the number of output per person are much more similar in 2009 here than they were in 1950. So put another way, those countries that were behind have grown faster over time, reducing the gap between them and the United States. So meaning that the countries have grown closer to the United States, meaning that they have converged. In 1950, output per person in the United States was roughly twice the level of output per person in France, as you can see, between the United States and that of France. And more than 4 times that of Japan. So if you compare Japan to the United States. However, today these perceptions have faded and the numbers explain themselves, as you can see in 2009. So using the PPP numbers, the United States output per person is still the highest, but in 2009 it was only 20% above average output per person in the other three countries. A much smaller difference than it was in 1950. So in essence, if you compare the numbers in 2009 and those in 1950, you will see that the countries that were lagging behind have actually grown significantly and closer to those of the United States, because we're using United States to compare them. So this is what we call the convergence, the closing over time. So let's look at South Africa. So the standard of living in South Africa has basically increased over time when looking at the American numbers. As you can see, the positive gradient over time. This shows that South Africa has produced quite positively over the time, even though it was more fluctuating at some point, as you can see at the upward trends and the downward trends at some point. But overall, we see a positive gradient, and which shows us that it has basically increased over time. But let's see when we compare the standard of living to that of the United States. So this picture shows us that there has been quite a divergence, or there hasn't been any convergence between South Africa and the United States, as United States has grown quite higher, but over time we see this space growing, meaning that the two countries are growing away from each other, meaning are diverging from each other instead of converging. This suggests that the standard of living in South Africa, despite the fact that it has increased over time, it is, however, increasing at a lesser rate when compared to that of the United States, or rather, the United States standard of living is growing at a faster rate than that of South Africa. So when being compared together, we see that between the two, there's been quite a divergence, and they've basically not grown closer with time. Instead, they've grown away from each other. Okay, so let's end it here for this video or this section, and we'll deal with the last part of our chapter 10 in the next video. Thank you.